Alright, so you may know that the art world, myself included, kind of loves the Obama portrait. Hell, people outside the art world love it as well. So I want to take a few minutes to explain why I like the Obama portrait so much, and I'm going to need to start this one back in the early Renaissance. I'm sorry, but stay with me on this journey. It'll be fun. I just need to give a little bit of background on portraiture first. Much of the art produced during the early Renaissance was religious. Churches had the money to commission altarpieces and frescoes that told the story of biblical figures or saints. A lot of the artists got their training through the church. This is all to say, not many living human beings were able to see themselves in paint. During this time, to be alive and to see yourself in a portrait, with very few exceptions, you would need to be of noble blood. That's just the reality of it. But then, as the early modern period progressed, some merchants and bankers began to acquire piles of money. These merchants and bankers were not biblical, they were not saints, they were not nobility, but they might commission a painting that used their likeness to illustrate a biblical figure or a saint. Like the Medici family, for example, who were not nobility, but they had piles of money, and they also had the artist Botticelli use them as models in his painting of the Adoration of the Magi. At some point, people with enough money dropped the pretense of spirituality and just started commissioning portraits of themselves directly with more frequency. They desired to see themselves glorified in paint, to have a record of their likeness that would survive them, to look cool in their fancy and best outfits. So at this point, in the early modern period, there were two ways that one could appear in paint ultimately. Either die and be canonized as a saint, or have boatloads of money, either through inheritance or through unregulated early capitalism. There were, of course, a few exceptions to this. The artist Caravaggio did occasionally take people off of the street, everyday people, and he'd paint them from life into biblical scenes. It brought an authenticity to the stories he was telling. They look real. He famously painted the dust on their feet and treated it as a sacred part of the divine story. But most people never got to see themselves in paint. Most people, kind people, people worthy of recognition and deserving of attention, have had their likeness appear on this earth and then vanish forever. We don't get to see their humanity in museums. Their record is lost. Kings and queens and those people in the portraits get to have complex lives in our history books. We can talk about how clever or foolish their decisions were. We can say that Henry VIII was kind to Jane Seymour, but a total jerk to Anne of Cleves. He can be both of those things, kind and a jerk. We see him as a human being who contains multitudes, as we all do. That one was for the Whitman fans in the audience, or I guess the Ed Yong fans. So those everyday people who lived and died and never appeared in a portrait, we don't get to see them complexly. When they appear in our history books, they're called the common people, or farmers, or the urban poor, or some other term that creates a monolith of a complex group filled with individuals, but under one heading. And this brings me to the main subject of this video. Kehinde Wiley, 21st century portrait artist and the person who painted Obama's official portrait. Before this commission, Kehinde Wiley was already a rock star in the art world, and specifically in the field of portraiture. He finds the models for his paintings in a similar way that Caravaggio did. He goes to crowded sidewalks and asks people for a moment of their time. If that conversation goes well, he'll have the person pose in a position of traditional power, and the result is something like this. In this painting, located in Brooklyn's Museum of Art, Wiley uses the iconic portrait of Napoleon crossing the Alps as a template. The original painting by Jacques-Louis David is not an accurate representation of a historical event. This painting is propaganda. It didn't actually happen. Napoleon crossed the Alps a few days after his men, and he did so on a reliable donkey. So, in other words, Napoleon chose how he wanted history to see him. Powerful, in charge, determined, larger than life. Not everybody gets to make that choice, and that's part of Wiley's motivation. His early work was inspired by a mugshot of a black male he found crumpled up on the street, and this spawned ideas about those who get to fashion their own image and construct their own power, and those who do not. Those who have their image shaped by those in power. Napoleon controls his image. The man in the mugshot does not. But both are ultimately false representations of complex human beings. But Napoleon has the agency in the fiction constructed about him. The man in the mugshot does not. And so, in an image like Napoleon leading the army over the Alps, Wiley carefully constructs an image of a model, whose name we can assume is Williams, since that's the name that appears on the rock along with other powerful men who have crossed the Alps. David constructed the image of power for Napoleon, he built it out of thin air, and Wiley constructs the image of power for Williams. Now, Wiley's construction of power is obviously more self-aware in the ways that he is building an image of masculinity, and his images avoid aggressive, angry, or violent representations of black men. Even though Williams is leading the viewer into battle, he's not threatening. You're encouraged to follow him. He is, as noted by the curator and art historian Taína Caragol, self-possessed rather than defiant. Perhaps even more importantly, it shows many sides to the humanity of the central figure. The decorative background softens the general tone of the image so that that central figure isn't simply a militaristic or combative posture. It's playing with traditions of masculinity by including things like tiny sperm cells floating around. Williams is more than just one thing. He is masculine, but that's not all he is. In his World's Stage project, Wiley traveled around the world and adopted the iconographies of many traditions. He studied Israeli, Chinese, and Brazilian traditions of portraiture. He evolved out of strictly European traditions to look at different ways power and masculinity are portrayed in other cultures. But of course, these traditions are fluid and they impact each other. The iconography of Brazil, for example, includes a lot of Christian imagery from the Portuguese influence, who adopted their iconographies from Italian and Byzantine traditions. Let's take an example. He studied representations of Albert Santos Dumont, a Brazilian national hero and innovator of aviation. Santos Dumont thought of flight as a tool for connecting people and a step in the direction of world peace. There is a statue of him in Rio de Janeiro, posed as Icarus, a Brazilian national hero who sought the connection of the globe, memorialized in the context of a Greek myth. Wiley took this statue and posed one of his street-cast models in the same position, but without wings. Ready to fly, but no wings. He named this painting Santos Dumont, father of aviation. So now, it's a black man posed like a Brazilian national hero using Greek mythology. Kehinde Wiley builds a huge tent and invites everyone and all artistic traditions in, and gives everyone power and respect. Santos Dumont, the model, and the artistic tradition are all respected here. In an interview about his statue, Rumors of War, which debuted in Times Square last year, he said that the traditions of the Western canon and equestrian sculpture might be ridiculous. Even though all this chest beating is symptomatic of a broader illness, we can compose poetry of broken bones. His work is that poetry, formed from traditions that are sometimes absurd and sometimes supported power structures of oppression. He finds a way to find beauty and fix the problems of art by creating more art. By including everyone and inviting all people and all traditions in, he is flattening the hierarchy of power. Or at least he's broadening the definition of power to include everyone. Which brings me to his treatment of women. In his Economies of Grace series, he used women as models for the first time. In images like this one from the exhibit, he leaned into the traditions surrounding glamour. He had custom-made dresses from a French couture shop with bespoke design and tailoring, just like those older portraits. For this series, he did his typical street casting for models, and then, through portraiture, revealed the power that these women have by using pre-existing visual vocabulary for both power and glamour. That visual vocabulary, which includes the scale of the paintings, some of these are larger than life, it dates back to the early modern period. It's a vocabulary of power that we already know, but this time it's used to respect those who are not often respected, yet no less deserving. Which brings me to a common aspect of his painting that exists in much of his portraiture, including the paintings in the Economy of Grace. This quirky feature of the background creeping up into the foreground. There are lots of interpretations for this. Some people say that it represents the inevitability of nature encroaching on our constructions of power. which of course calls attention to the fact that power itself is a construct in the first place. Another interpretation is that the background, the people who do not typically get to see themselves represented in paint, are being moved to the foreground, rescued from a past and propelled into the future. These people have their likenesses preserved in a museum and studied many years after their deaths. So the background, metaphorically, moves into the foreground. So much of Kehinde Wiley's work is about giving power and representation to people and experiences and stories who do not often get to see themselves in museums or high-end galleries. People who do not have the traditional forms of power. He, as the artist, is able to lift people up and allow them to have that power. So then, what happens when an artist like that has to paint and contend with a model who has traditional power? What happens when he is commissioned to paint a portrait of somebody who, for 8 years, held the most powerful office in the entire world? Well, this is what happens. Obama was the first African-American president, and Kehinde Wiley was the first African-American portrait artist to be commissioned for an official portrait of the American president. It's history on both sides. And given what we know of the traditions of portraiture and the context of Kehinde Wiley's other work, let's finally take a look at this painting. So first, he didn't play his typical game of posing Obama in the style of a European nobleman. That would obviously be inappropriate in this context. So it's an original posture, and one that, according to Taína Caragol, emphasizes a language of openness and accessibility. He stares directly at you, and according to those who have seen it in person, I have not and cannot vouch for this directly, no matter where you stand in the room, it seems like his shoes, and therefore his body, are pointed toward you directly, ready to listen. He's giving you his attention. In Wiley's other work, it's important that we look up in reverence. In this one, as we look at it with reverence, the model, Obama, returns that respect. Wiley's portraiture gives power to the common person, and this portrait continues that work. It still imbues the everyday museum goer with power by showing presidential power ready to listen. The viewer is lifted up. And notice how that background is still creeping up on the foreground, but this time, the background has a particular significance. The flowers illustrate Obama's path to the presidency. African blue lilies from Kenya, white jasmine from Hawaii, and chrysanthemum from Chicago. So, in closing, when Kehinde Wiley is dealing with traditions specific to the Western art historical canon, a largely white, largely male landscape, and he's dealing with men of his own community, communities of color in the 21st century, there is an impulse to see those in opposition to each other. But Wiley's paintings find a way to build a tent big enough that we can love them both. We can say that those artistic traditions are beautiful, and so are these models. In an interview with Christine Y. Kim, Wiley said that it's always important not to shut the work down with any sense of high art audience versus black people in the street audience. I'm not interested in having to choose between being real and being heady. And in a documentary about his exhibit, Economies of Grace, Wiley says that the popularity of his images is in part due to how hungry people are to see what they know to be beautiful acknowledged as such. I think that is as true about the individual women and the portraits that he was speaking about at that moment as it is for the celebration of different traditions that his work so often includes. From Economy of Grace to the world stage and to the presidential portrait, we know our differences to be beautiful, and it is a pleasure, a relief, to see them acknowledged as such. If you like this video and want to see more like it, please consider subscribing. Thank you for watching.